about the book launch. This book is a labor of love, as you said, and it was launched in September 2024.
Yeah, it was launched on September the 5th, and we actually had a launch party at the Ralph Pucci International Showroom in New York. And the Ralph Pucci showroom it's a magnificent space. It's high-end furniture, an art gallery. Used to be a mannequin showroom, and Ralph Pucci built the Mannequin company. He's no longer in the mannequin business. As I said, now he's into fine art and high-end furniture. It was a magnificent space to launch the book. We had a huge crowd of over 200 people there, and it was just spectacular. In the book, I'm delighted to recant some of the stories, anecdotes, and nuances of these very significant stars, if you will, of the retail world. Now, they've been referred to as the quintessential silent salesperson, but mannequins are so much more than that. To me, they're actually works of art. There are many books out on the history of mannequins. This isn't about the history of mannequins, although I do cover that at some length. It's really an anthropological study of us, of our culture, because as our culture has evolved, mannequins have followed. They follow what happens in the world. And yeah, they are selling tools. There's no question about that. They've been referred to as the quintessential silent sales force, but they're much, much more than that. To me, they're actually works of art. And well, how do you define art? I think that's an important step to understanding the book. To me, art serves three purposes. One, storytelling. What is the story? It's the story of us. Two, art documents any point in time, any point in our culture, what's going on, what's happening at that time. And three, it's a bookmark, if you will, of our culture. That's what art is, all of those three. A mannequin, if it's strategically placed and artistically designed, it does all three of those things. Now, Salvador Dali told us that a true artist is not one who is inspired, but rather one who inspires others. When you come into our store, we're in the business of inspiration. We're in the business of inspiring others. And inspiration is all around us. Walk into a store, and you'll see inspiration. How do you define art also? What makes something an object or an activity? What makes it an artistic endeavor? And to me, it's when you move the emotions. And when you engage a mannequin, it clearly moves your emotions. And that's really what the book is about. It documents who we are at any point in time, because as we have evolved, the mannequin has evolved as well. And I think it's the enlightened visionary who will bring art into the retail environment. Mannequins, they stir our emotions, they attract our attention, they're aspirational, they always wear what we would love to own. I've been in this industry for well over 30 years, the retail design industry, and I started with a degree in fine art. And when I graduated with a major in fine art, concentration in painting, and a minor in architecture, when I graduated, living in Brooklyn, New York, I just wanted what I did, I set up a painting studio in Brooklyn. And all was fine with the world until one day there was a knock at the door. And who was it? It was the landlord. What did the landlord want? He wanted his rent money. I knew then and there that I had to find a real job. So I got a hold of the Sunday New York Times, went to the classified section. And no, there was no internet in those days. And yes, I am that old. Thank you very much. And I poured through the columns looking for some job somewhat related to the art world. Couldn't find anything. And then there it was, a display trimmer. I said, what is that? Sounds cool. I tried it. It loved me. I loved it. And that launched my career as a retail designer. Now, during my career, as I said, well over 30 years, I've worked in 4 different sectors of the retail design industry. I was the corporate director of visual merchandising for a major New York, New Jersey department store, a Stearns department store, a division of Federated Department Stores. I was there for 14 years. After that, I went to work for Walker Group C&I. The Walker Group, at the time, was the largest architectural retail design company in the world. And that began my career as a world traveler. We designed stores all over the world, from Santiago, Chile, to Ulsan, South Korea. Now, when in my life would I ever have been in these places? Bogota, Colombia. I can go on and on and on, the places I've been to as a retail designer. So since then, I've been traveling all over the world, from Dusseldorf, Germany, to Ancona, Italy, to Sao Paulo, Brazil, as a retail designer. I've also worked, and continue to work to this day, I'm the New York editor of Visual Merchandising and Store Design magazine. I've been in that capacity since the year 2000, and in that capacity, I've written well over 200 articles about retail design. And lastly, I've worked in the educational sector. I was the chair of the visual merchandising department at a small college in New York City, LIM College, where I developed the first 4-year BBA program in visual merchandising. And I also went on to develop the first master's program in visual merchandising. So I have an extensive background in this area. I was traveling in, I believe it was Santiago, Chile, with a very dear friend of mine who owned a mannequin company called Expor Mannequins. And I didn't know much about them, but I found out they were the largest seller of mannequins in all of Latin America. And one day we were traveling, we became very good friends. One day we were traveling on a business trip throughout South America. We went to 4 different countries, 5 different cities, but I had to work for my supper because each stop along the way I had to give a presentation about visual merchandising. And one day, his name was Marcos Andrade, he said to me, "Why don't you write a book?" I said, "A book?" He said, "Sure, a book." I said, "About what?" He said, "About mannequins, of course." And that ignited the fire, that lit the fire. I've been interested in mannequins for my entire career, never thought to write a book. And here I am, a writer, journalist in VM and SD magazine. And that happened about 4 years ago. And that started the idea of writing this book, Profiles of the Mannequin. And as I said, there are a lot of mannequin books out there that talk about the history of mannequins. This does talk about the history, but it really, truly is an anthropological study into our culture, into us, into who we are.
You also conducted a large number of interviews for this book.
Yeah, it's a good point. During my career, I pretty much know everybody in the industry, and I had access to so many people, and I've interviewed well over 30 people for this book, from Ralph Pucci to Carol Barnhart. I can go on and on and on. So many people who really gave me inside information, gave me very lovely anecdotes, very interesting stories about how they developed mannequins, how they designed mannequins, how they used mannequins, how they implemented mannequins. While, again, there are books on the history of mannequins, this is really an inside story of the visionaries, the creatives who really brought these fabulous forms to life.
The mannequin became really a persona.
Yeah, the mannequins take on a life of their own, and they're very aspirational. As I said, they always seem to wear what we would love to own. But they're storytellers, is what they are. Again, they tell the story of us at any point in time, what's going on in the world. And people gravitate towards that. Let me go back in history a little bit. History is dealt with in this book. Mannequins, the first mannequin, you'll find this interesting. The first known example of a mannequin goes back to 1323 BC. And when Howard Carter, an English archaeologist, uncovered King Tut's tomb, in the tomb, he found a wooden sculpture in the likeness of the boy king. And it's believed, and is right by his bed, in his living quarters. It is believed that every morning, that mannequin, if you will, that wooden mannequin, was used to prepare the king's clothing for that day. So that's the earliest representation of the mannequin. Now, mannequins, as we know them, the modern mannequin, well, there are two major technological, if you will, developments that led to the beginning of the mannequin as we know it. And it happened at the turn of the last century, the early 1900s. And the two advances were, one was cast iron. And what did cast iron do? It allowed for large expanses. The next innovation was plate glass. What did that do? It allowed us to cover these large expanses. And what did that give us? It gave us the first show windows. And it was the impetus for the whole industry or career of visual merchandising, or display as it was known back then. Now, for example, there was a section in New York City at the beginning of the late 1800s, 1896 through 1912. It was called Ladies' Mile. And that was where the first department stores, arguably the first department stores, were. And running down 6th Avenue in New York, it was like walking through a crystal palace of windows. There were windows everywhere. And who was the star of the window? The mannequin. The mannequin. And that led to the mannequin as we know it today. And certainly they've gone through many, many iterations. The very first mannequin, well, it was made out of wax. What is the problem with a wax mannequin? It melted in the heat of the sun. So retail has always been fast to embrace the latest and greatest technologies. We certainly see what's happening today. Today we have artificial intelligent mannequins. But back in the day, they were making mannequins out of wax. It didn't work. Technologies improved. They started making them out of plaster. And I'm going to tell you a very interesting, and the book is filled with a lot of anecdotal stories, a lot of interesting stories, a lot of cool stories, a lot of fun stories. And I'm going to tell you one of my favorite stories right now. There was a mannequin designer in the 1930s. His name was Lester Gabber. And he started his career, he was an artist, he was making sculptures out of soap. And one day a retailer discovered his sculptures and said, "You should be designing mannequins." So we started making mannequins, but he started making them out of plaster. That was the technology of the day, because the wax didn't work. The plaster didn't melt in the sun, but it weighed 200 pounds. And if you dropped her, it went to 2,000 pieces. Anyway, Lester makes a mannequin, and she's in a sitting position with a hand cocked like this, almost as though she's smoking a cigarette. And he named her Cynthia. Wherever Lester went, whether he went to the opera, who was sitting next to him in the box, Cynthia. If he went out to dinner, who was at the table with him, Cynthia. If he was on a bus going down 5th Avenue, who was sitting in the seat next to him on the bus, it was Cynthia. People started to think Lester was, well, a little crazy. But Lester ended up laughing all the way to the bank. Wherever he went, Cynthia went with him. Before long, anytime there was a fashion launch or a fragrance launch, that brand, that label wanted Cynthia to represent the launch. Before long, Cynthia was featured on the cover of Life magazine. She was all the rage. Before long, Cynthia even had her own radio show. This is in the 1930s. That's how popular she became. And Lester, as I said, was thrilled with his creation, Cynthia. One day, there was a launch, fragrance launch. And who was the center of attention? Of course, it was Cynthia. And she was sitting there in her chair, smoking a cigarette. Somebody bumped into Cynthia. Cynthia fell to the floor. Cynthia went to 2,000 pieces. That was the end of Cynthia. And Lester was heartbroken. He never rebuilt Cynthia. And that's one of my favorite mannequin stories. But there are so many stories like that in the book. Earlier, I mentioned Salvador Dali. Another one of my favorite stories is about Salvador Dali. He was hired by a company, a high-end company on 5th Avenue at the time, I think this was the year 1938, to do a window. The company was Bonwood Teller on Fifth Avenue in New York City. So Dolly, in his inimitable way, got an old claw-toothed bathtub, put it in the window, filled it with murky water, dressed the mannequin in a risque, if you will, a negligee, stepping into the water. Coming out of her hair were beetles and blood. And in the water were 7 arms coming out of the water, the murky water, each holding a mirror focused on the mannequin's face. And the name of the window was Narcissus White. Well, customers walked by, they looked at the window, but they were horrified. They complained to management. Management walked by, they looked at the window, they were horrified. Management got a hold of their maintenance department to change Master Salvador Dali's window. Well, Salvador Dali walked by. He was really horrified. So horrified was Dali that he walked into the window, picked up the bathtub, and threw it through the glass. A whole scene ensued. The police were called. Dali was fined $500, the exact amount he was paid to do the window in the first place. And what did Dali say? And this is interesting for everybody out there studying marketing or working in marketing. What did Dali say? He said, if I ate all of Fifth Avenue, I wouldn't have gotten as much publicity as I've gotten today. And that's another one of my favorite stories. Now, I'll tell you another story actually about the importance of the mannequin. Sure, they're the quintessential silent salesperson. And yes, I mentioned that they really are reflections of our culture, of who we are. They're also the communicator of the brand. What do I mean by that? There was an industrial designer by the name of Raymond Loewy. Many people never heard of Raymond Loewy, but he touches our lives every single day. Raymond Loewy designed everything from lipstick to locomotives. I can go on and on and on. This man designed from the Coca-Cola bottle to the Studebaker automobile, to the post office logo, to the Shell Oil Company logo, to the interior of NASA's Skylab. I can go on and on and on. The man was brilliant. Before his illustrious career as an industrial designer, he had a brief stint with Macy's. He was a young man at the time. Brief stint with Macy's as a window designer. Now, what did he do? He took one single mannequin, placed her in the window, focused 2 spotlights on her, and he quit the next day before Macy's could fire him. Why? Because back in the day, the retailers just took everything they owned and shoveled it into windows. And Raymond Loewy said this: simplicity is the deciding factor in the aesthetic equation. Loewy knew he wasn't trying to sell that evening gown that day. He knew he was trying to project the brand image of Macy's out onto the street. Mannequins are the communicator of the brand. In the book, I also talk about a guy by the name of L. Frank Baum. Does that ring a bell to you, L. Frank Baum? Well, L. Frank Baum wrote The Wizard of Oz. Why is he in this book? He wrote The Wizard of Oz. Well, I'll tell you why. I mentioned earlier that I'm the New York editor of Visual Merchandising and Store Design magazine. Well, 2 years before L. Frank Baum wrote The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, he started a publication called The Show Window. And The Show Window evolved into our magazine today. So our magazine has good bones. It was started by L. Frank Baum. Well, what did he have to do with that? He came along at the time the department store came along. Nobody knew what to do with these huge buildings that had all this stuff in them. Nobody knew what to do with it. Along comes L. Frank Baum, obviously a creative guy. Hey, he wrote The Wizard of Oz, and he had a background in theater. He started our publication called The Show Window, and he was one of the very first advocates for the use of the mannequin. And in that very first publication, and I'm going to paraphrase, see if I remember this, this is what he said. He said, "Bring the goods out in a blaze of glory, make them look like jewels." And again, the first advocate for the use of mannequins. Now I'm going to digress for a minute and tell you a quick story about our founder, the founder of our magazine, L. Feigenbaum. Sitting at his desk as the founder and editor of this new magazine, he gazed across at his filing cabinet, and the top drawer of the cabinet was labeled A to N, A to N. And he looked at the bottom drawer, and it was labeled O to Z, O Z. Then he had the name of his magical kingdom, Oz. And that's a true story. That's a true story. So the book is filled with stories such as this. So again, it talks about the history, but it talks about the people, such as L. Feigenbaum, who really brought these fabulous forms to life.
The mannequin is perceived as belonging to a higher class, those who can afford clothing. People who come from lower backgrounds may not relate to the mannequin as people from more artistic classes or more affluent classes relate to the mannequin. How would you promote the mannequin to, let's say, working class or people living in the countryside?
When doing a visual merchandising display, many people think budget is what's important, but the capital that's important is intellectual capital or creative capital. I think everybody can be touched emotionally. I think that's what mannequins do. And sure, there are mannequins that grace the windows of high-end department stores, and they have a particular targeted customer in mind. But I think everybody should be treated equally. Everybody should have the ability to go to a store. Sure, there are price points. Some people can afford to go to a high-end store. Some people can't. But that doesn't mean we can't communicate with people from any socioeconomic background. And we want to do that. We want to engage everybody. And messages may be different, for sure. But everybody deserves and wants to and needs to be touched, to be communicated. The store is a tool of communication. The language spoken within that store is visual merchandising. And one of the most important tools that a visual merchandiser has is the mannequin. And there are, as I said, there are stores that grace Fifth Avenue or Champs-Élysées. Then there were stores on Main Street America. And these people deserve and need, and they have needs and wants. We all have needs and wants. I said the mannequin is the communicator of the brand. A high-end store might choose mannequin A. Another store on Main Street, Kansas City, may choose another kind of mannequin. But still, that mannequin is going to engage. At the end of the day, it's to engage the customer. And as I said earlier, to strike a responsive chord. Now, there are mannequins you can pay $1,500 for some mannequins, and you could pay $300 for another kind of mannequin. And you find the mannequin that will best connect with your brand, with who you are, and who your customer is. That's a very good question, but that's my answer.
Looking back at the process, creating the book and researching the book, is there something that you would have done differently?
I don't think so, because the impetus started when I began my career as a display trimmer. I had no contact with mannequins before other than to see them in the stores, but I never handled or touched or dressed, for sure, a mannequin. And early in my career, to tell you the truth, I was always fine with the world when I got my first job as a display trimmer. But after a while, I started to wrestle with this whole concept. I mean, after all, what am I doing? Just trying to sell a pair of jeans? I wanted to be an artist. But then I had an epiphany. As I mentioned earlier, I realized that retail design, that retail itself is merely a reflection of who we are. If you hold a mirror to the face of retail, the reflected image will be us. And then I realized that what I was doing was really important. So I really started to engage with the mannequin. I started to realize that you could use it as an artistic tool. So I've had all of this experience over these many years in retail design. And then I said I had the impetus to write the book. I've been blessed to have known so many people in the industry, and I could not have written the book without all of my connections, without all of the people who I know, because as I said, as you mentioned, there were well over 30 people who were interviewed in the book. It took 4 years to put this all together. There was a wonderful article in Women's Wear Daily about the book. I believe I sent that to you. And when I was interviewed by them, they remarked a lot of research went into this book, and it really did. Researching of certainly the history, but it was more so the conversations or the interviews that I had with so many people. Ralph Pucci comes to mind. His parents owned a mannequin repair company. Ralph graduated from college, went to work for the company. One day said to his father, "Why are we repairing other people's mannequins? Why don't we design our own?" And his father was very open-minded, and he gave him the go-ahead to do that. And he started to design his own mannequins. And his brilliance also was, why should I design the same kind of mannequins everybody else is doing? What they're doing works. Let me do something else. Dare to be different. And I think that's what I did with this book. As I said, there are many books out there. I dared to be different. I took a very different approach to this book. The approach was based on, as you mentioned, all of the interviews that I did with so many people from across these strata within this industry.
What about the company, the publishing company, Bloomsbury? How did you decide to collaborate with them?
Writing the book was the easy part. As I said, I am a writer. It's all of the other things that you have had to do, and finding the right publisher was certainly a journey as well. And quite frankly, I found them from the friend of a friend who was familiar with my writing. So I sent them an abstract, and they really liked what they read. And the rest was history. And they've been wonderful. They've been very helpful, very supportive along the way. As I said, I've written many articles. This is my first book, and they really guided me along the way. So it's been a terrific relationship. And as you know, Bloomsbury is one of the biggest publishers in the industry. So I'm delighted. I'm honored actually to have worked with Bloomsbury.
With the advancement of technology, do you think that windows will change, visual merchandising will change, and will become more technical, more electronic?
It's a great question, and it's the right question for where we are. The hallmark of retail has been its ability to change and to embrace the latest and greatest technologies. As I mentioned, we've gone from wax to plastic to fiberglass. Now we have artificial intelligent mannequins. Now, the debate is over. Stores, physical stores, brick and mortar stores are not going away. But we've talked about, is it going to be the physical store? Is it going to be the digital store? The two must be spiritually united. They have to work together. The new window, the new facade today is your phone, your mobile device. You see the store. You know what? Think about fireworks. In the United States, every 4th of July, particularly in New York City, we have these great firework presentations. And it's fascinating. Close your eyes for a minute and think about fireworks. Now open them. fireworks, shopping online is as exciting as watching fireworks on television, you know? And we hear all this talk about omni-channel. Well, I believe in omnipresence. The two have to work together. You have to touch your customers digitally and physically. The store itself, the physical store, is the touchstone of the brand. It's the retailer's most important capital, is that physical store, particularly after what we've gone through in the past few years, with the pandemic. People want to get out. They want to have that tactile experience. They want to kick the tires, if you will. They want to be entertained, if you will. And that's what shopping in a store should be. But as I said, the two have to be spiritually united. Same with mannequins. I've been involved with a company that's involved with artificial intelligence mannequin. And I said to them, this is great. It really is. But you need to balance it with the physical mannequin. The two have to work together. And for sure, you're going to see windows today with artificial intelligence in them where you can go through their offerings of, say, dresses, and you can see the dress in the window on yourself. Don't like that color? You can change the color. You can see through artificial intelligence what you're going to look like wearing that dress. And this is where mannequins are going, but you're still going to need that tactile mannequin. Again, they have to work together. So sure, visual merchandising will always change. And this is what I see as the change coming. We'll have AI mannequins, but they're going to work hand in hand still with the physical mannequin.
Let's talk about the audience. Some people might think that this is a book for primarily women or those in the fashion industry. How do we convince people who are not necessarily interested in fashion and not necessarily women that this book is worth reading?
It's worth reading because the mannequin is the vehicle for the story that I'm trying to tell. The story I'm trying to tell is the story of our history and of our culture. As I said, the mannequin is the vehicle that communicates where we are, or where we were, who we were at any point in time. I'll give you an example how mannequins respond to what's going on. During World War II, mannequins became shorter. You know why? They became shorter because of rationing. Mannequins always reflect who we are, what's going on in the world. In the 70s, with the advent of feminism, well, mannequins became more self-assured. They weren't necessarily the idealized version, man's version of what a mannequin should be or what a woman should be. They became more self-assured, more assertive. So they always reflect what's going on. In the 60s, mannequin company, Adele Rootstein, who was referred to as the Rolls-Royce of mannequins, she developed the first African-American mannequin. It was in the height of the civil rights movement. So what's going on in the world is reflected through the mannequin. So I rather think, sure, this will appeal to people in the visual merchandising industry, in the fashion industry. It will also appeal to people who are interested in sociology. It's an anthropological study. You'll meet visionaries and creators from, as I mentioned, Salvador Dali, Michelangelo is mentioned in the book. I can go on and on and on. Shakespeare is mentioned in the book. I can go on and on and on as to who you will come across when reading this book.
If you could make a change or an adjustment to the mannequin as it is today, what would it be?
Going forward, mannequins have become more abstract. And there are many practical reasons for this. It's easier to maintain. It's easier to dress an abstract mannequin. You need less lighting for an abstract mannequin. I think art can be subtle. Creativity can be subtle. An overt expression not very artistic, but subtlety is a great art tool. And I don't think you have to be 100% realistic to be an effective mannequin. A great art wants to be suggestive of an idea. You don't have to be that literal. So I think abstract mannequins have their place. Yeah, I think you can say more with less. You know, we all know that saying, less is more. That was coined by Mies van der Rohe, by the way. So I don't think you have to be that literal when designing a mannequin. You could be suggestive of a concept, suggestive of an idea. So abstraction going forward.
And right now, are you taking a break or are you working on a special project?
I'm never taking a break. I love what I'm doing. I really, really do. I'll be heading to Australia in March to give a presentation to an architectural group. I'm continuing to write. As I said, I am the New York editor of Visual Merchandising and Store Design magazine. I do a monthly blog for that magazine. I do several articles a year for that magazine. I have a book almost complete called Diamonds in the Window. And it's about a dear friend of mine named Raymond Mastroboni. And Raymond was the window designer, visual merchandiser, planner, store designer for Cartier for 40 years. And while I was teaching at LIM College, I hired Raymond to teach. And Raymond would teach every Monday. And every Monday morning, he would come into my office with a bag of cookies, and we'd sit down and we would talk about design, about the world, about visual merchandising. And one day I said, I should be writing this stuff down because Raymond is brilliant. And Raymond's brilliance was his ability to understand what was going on in the world at any point in time, which is what my book is about. That's what the mannequin does. It understands what's going on in the world. Give you an example of Raymond's brilliance. One time, there was a garbage strike in New York City, and it was in the middle of the summer, and the garbage was piling up on Fifth Avenue. People were getting a little upset. You know, it was hot. Garbage was, it wasn't nice. What did Raymond do? He took an old garbage pail, put it in the window of Cartier, and he rigged it so the top of the garbage pail, or the lid, would pop up. And when it popped up, a mangy cat would pop up. But the cat was wearing $1 million diamond brooch or necklace. That was the brilliance of Raymond Mastroboni. He understood what was going on, what people were thinking about. Another time, there was a window washer strike in New York City. If you were a retailer and you dared to wash your own windows, next morning you would have eggs splattered all over your windows. Or worse, your window would be broken. People were not happy. What did Raymond do? He picked up on this. On the inside of the window, he installed a pipe. From the pipe came water drizzling down over the inside of the window. Then he created a windshield wiper that went back and forth. And as the windshield wiper did its thing, you would see the diamond in the window. That was the brilliance of Raymond Mastroboni. He understood what was going on. Many years ago, Cabbage Patch Doll was all the rage. Couldn't get them. Raymond asked all of his daughter's little friends if he could borrow the Cabbage Patch Doll from them. And in return, he promised them a silver spoon. So he was able to gather several Cabbage Patch Dolls that way, put them all in Cartier's window, wearing diamonds and jewels. Traffic was stopped for hours. People wanted to see the Cabbage Patch Dolls in Cartier's windows. That was the brilliance of Raymond Mastroboni, understanding what's going on. As I said, Raymond Mastroboni, he was quite brilliant. And his contemporary was Jean Moore. Who was Jean Moore? Jean Moore did the windows at Tiffany's for 50 years. 50 years. And they kind of had a friendly competition. Gene was a little older. Gene was known as, for want of a better term, the father of visual merchandising. He was the one who really elevated it to an art form. And the two had a friendly competition. And one day, Gene was walking past the Cartier windows, and he noticed a fog emanating in the windows. And Gene said, "How did that guy do that?" Now, that's not exactly what he said, but I cleaned it up a little bit. How did he do that? And Ray's mantra was, if you can imagine it, you can create it. And how he made the fog emanating in the window, he created a false bottom, put in a live plant underneath with dried ice, and this created a fog. And again, his mantra was, if you can imagine it, you can create it. So Raymond was a brilliant guy, an inspirational guy. I learned a great deal from my relationship with Raymond. He is mentioned in Profiles of the Mannequin because of his ability to understand what was going on in the world. So, all of these things are in the book. So to answer your earlier question, this book would appeal to people across many, many different levels. Profiles of the Mannequin talks about how the mannequin reflected or reflects what's going on. So I'm just about complete with that book called Diamonds in the Window. So no, slowing down. No, I'm always on the go, always busy, always doing something, and I'm having a wonderful time doing so. We've had, after the book launch at Pucci in September, we had a book launch in Kansas City at a convention called IRDC, the International Retail Design Conference. So we book launched over there as well. And then we had a book signing at Ohio State University a couple of weeks ago. So yeah, I'm continuing to do that as well, taking the book on the road, if you will.
Are you still painting?
I do still paint. Right now I'm doing oil pastels, and I base them on photography. I love photography. I spend a lot of time in Central Park in New York City, photographing. I've lived in New York all of my life, but every single time I go to Central Park, I find something new and I photograph it. And I think photography, seeing things that other people may not necessarily see, capturing light, capturing angles. So I've been basing a series of oil pastels, and I'll describe that in a moment, on my photography. I've traveled all over the world, so I've done paintings of places from Beijing to Ancona, Italy. And right now, I started my career as a painter using acrylics on canvas. Now I'm doing oil pastels. And when I was in Paris, the last time I was in Paris, I discovered Sennelier pastels. And this is a very oily, high in viscosity pastel. So the technique I'm working on now is varying the viscosity of the pastels. What do I mean by that? On the base coat, I will use a very dry oil pastel. The middle coat will be a little more oily, a little more viscosity. And on the top coat would be the Senneliers, which is very high in viscosity. So I would build layers, and that creates volume, it creates form. And then I would scratch away some of the top layers to create this technique. So I'm still painting. These are smaller formats, but I am still doing that and making new discoveries along the way. And I believe one art form informs the other. Let's talk about Ralph Pucci again. Ralph Pucci, he's not a painter, he's not a writer, he's not a musician. One of his great talents is finding talent and putting it together. He'll take a a painter and make them a sculptor. He'll take a sculptor and make them a furniture designer, and so on and so forth, and interject music along the way. And I believe music is the highest form of art, by the way, because music has the ability to move us instantly, to move our emotions instantly. But I really believe in the cross-pollination of the arts. Ingres, the French painter Ingres, said to his painting students, if I could make musicians out of you, you would profit as painters. So I truly believe in that cross-pollination of the arts. So I not musical. If my brother, my sister, my father were all very musical, somehow that gene passed me by, and yet my writing is very rhythmic. Is very rhythmic. So I think all of the art forms, one informs the other, and you build upon that. Yeah. Retirement isn't in my vocabulary. I'm having a great time doing what I'm doing.